Hello everyone, hope you're doing well. So, if you are someone who has been watching these videos of mine, then you know that one of the reoccurring themes is the exploration of ideas and the sense of being on a quest or a journey to learn more and to dig deeper and to take arguments and beliefs to their logical conclusions. Now, there are some who stop at certain points along this journey. And in one way or another, they imply or they make it quite clear that this is as far as they're willing to go. This is as deep as they're willing to dig. They're not interested in exploring a particular idea any further. And that's fine. Often they do this for practical or pragmatic reasons, which is fine. For me personally, I truly love immersing myself in a topic and devouring as much information and knowledge as possible. I find it thrilling to explore dangerous or provocative ideas. And I find it equally thrilling to have my own conceptions challenged. And so what this means is there are things that I might have said in previous videos that I would like to reevaluate, because as I learn more, for example, about the history of the Second World War, I find that certain notions I had are inaccurate, that certain things I believed about certain individuals aren't really true, or there's more to the story. It's not so black and white. Or, for example, I'm learning more about the links between culture and civilization and race and DNA and genetics, and how we are not all the same. Okay? Well, then how deep do the differences go? And what are the consequences and effects of those differences? And so, in a way, this process, this journey, is both slow and rapid at the same time. And what I mean is, well, it's become part of common parlance to talk about the moment you were red-pilled or even black-pilled now. And in some cases, I was red-pilled years ago. I held contrarian beliefs, politically incorrect beliefs years ago. I've observed things that you weren't allowed to say out loud, but I could see them, I could observe them for years. And then in other cases, my red-pilled or black-pilled moment was a week ago. Depends on the topic. And so I do describe this as a journey because I feel like I am in motion and I'm moving towards a destination and picking up things along the way. And so lately, what I've been doing is digging deeper into the idea of nationalism and what that means in the 21st century, what it means for this current situation that we find ourselves in the West. And so digging deeper has led me to come to a sort of conclusion that ethno-nationalism is the logical next step, for me personally, in proclaiming oneself as a nationalist. Because if my concern is the survival and the thriving of Western civilization. And my belief is that that civilization is upheld by the people who comprise it, and that those people are the people of Europe or European descent, then it's not enough to simply go on about economic nationalism or just nationalism in a sense of upholding the nation state, because the nation state is a social construct. It truly is. The lefty types are right. Borders are a social construct. The borders can change. The countries can change. Catalonia can break off from Spain. Northern Italy can declare independence from southern Italy and become a new country. What's important is that the people who comprise these countries are still of the European nation, of the European gene pool. I don't mind defining the people of Europe as what they are and also what they are not. We are not African. We are not Middle Eastern. We are not Asian. We are Europeans. And if that's my primary concern, then I have to dig deeper and explore the idea of ethno-nationalism, the idea of Europe for the Europeans. And then how does that extend to the rest of Western civilization, Canada, the United States, and Australia? Okay, is it the same question? Is it the same situation? What are the differences? What are the solutions? What are some corrections that can be made? So it's a constant delving into the issue. And so what I've been doing lately is looking for instances of debate or discussion between and even amongst the alt-right, the identitarian movements, the ethno-nationalists, and discussions and debates between them and the classical liberals, the individualists, the sort of constitutional conservatives. Because I don't think there's much to gain or learn in owning the libs or owning the SJWs or taking on the diversity as our strength types. They are simply a thorn in our side, and we have to deal with that. We do have to take them on, but as far as an exercise in learning, in sharpening one's beliefs and arguments, it's very useless. The SJWs, the feminists, the open borders types are simply a weed that we need to eradicate. And so I find the discussion and the debates between these two sides, the classical liberals, the individualists, the identitarians, the ethno-nationalists, the nationalist types, to be much more invigorating and challenging and thought-provoking and useful. And it seems that one of the main sources of disagreement between these two sides, and even within the ranks themselves of these two sides, is the question of how. Because it seems that both sides and everyone who makes up the ranks within them, or most of the people who make up the ranks within them, recognize that there is a massive problem in the West. In every single Western country, there is this problem of culture clash, civilizational clash. And, in general, most people on these sides recognize that mass immigration is the source of this clash, that the mass immigration of non-Western peoples into the West is the source of this conflict, this clash. And there are some who might say that they actually don't care about the people who live in the West. They don't care if the European peoples get replaced, as long as the people who replace them adopt Western values. And at this point, I'm writing them off just as I write off the SJWs and the open borders types. I think this position is so weak and absurd and vacuous, and it only takes time and consequences to prove it wrong, really. So I'm not really gonna get too much into that, but it will influence the theme. Because, again, the difference seems to be a question of how to solve this problem, which both sides recognize. I mean, even the people who don't care about the demography or the identity of the people of the West recognize the problem of the risk of losing the values of the West that this culture clash, this mass migration is posing. And so one of the main sticking points regarding the how to solve this problem, how to correct it, how to ensure that Western civilization survives and thrives, seems to be the question of how to reclaim our civilization. Specifically, the question of violence. Now, this is one of those ideas that goes bump in the night. And so we're going to talk about it. We're going to turn on the light. In my opinion, the violence is already here. Hundreds of Europeans have been killed in the past few years alone by so-called refugees. There have been dozens of Europeans murdered at the hands of migrants from Africa and the Middle East. There have been thousands of women and children, girls and boys, raped by migrants from Africa and the Middle East. The violence is already here. So at this point, any action taken by the peoples of Europe is an act of self-defense, in which case it is justified. So, for example, if we are going to reclaim our lands and admit that Europe is for the Europeans, as the Dalai Lama is capable of saying, well then, the logical next step is the deportation of people who are not European. Now, in current year, that is already going to be described as an act of violence. So we are not even obliged to talk about physical violence with weapons, bullets, tanks, tear gas, force. Just the simple act of deporting, for example, people who are here illegally will be described as an act of violence by the left and even by some neocons and classical liberals, etc. People who might have a criminal record could be deported, and that would be described as violence. But then, what do you do about Savile Town, where 1% of the population is native white British and the rest of the population is non-British, and the vast majority of the population are a sect of hardcore Muslims? They might be there legally, but that is a conquered town. That is conquered land. And the point is, we need to take it back. So here's the question of the how. The classical liberals don't want to engage in violence. but the violence is already here. The second that 22 children are blown up at a pop concert, the second that fake refugees or failed asylum seekers commit acts of violence and commit crimes, should be all that is required to start sending people back. We have, for example, refugees from countries that are now safe to return to. These refugees might have been here for many years. They might have settled down in their millions. But now their country is safe to return to. They have to go back. This is not a violation of rights. In fact, it is the application of the law, of treaties. Secondly, rights are for citizens and people of the nation. There's a hierarchy of rights. For example, I'm not Spanish, but I live in Spain, and there are certain things that I'm not permitted to do. For example, voting in elections. So there are rights that are for the people of the nation that are off limits to people who are not of that nation. Whether or not they're there legally doesn't matter. There are a plethora of solutions. But I want to talk about this problem of violence that seems to be so taboo. I mentioned this in one of, I think, my very first video. And recently I watched a video by Vox Day, which I'll link to in the description. And it's about the similarities between immigration and invasion. Now, what I say in my very first video is that Europe is being invaded, and how this is a controversial thing to say. You say this and you will be tagged as a racist, as an alarmist. But whether or not it resembles the invasions of history, and that there are pitched battles and the sacking of towns, doesn't matter. The end results are the same. Loss of land, loss of territory, clash between the native population and the new arrivals, and a shift in who holds power. And in many ways, as the Vox Day video shows, immigration is worse. Because, for example, when the Germans invaded and occupied France, it was still French. The French people still existed. What happens with immigration is worse, because it's a demographic replacement. What's happening now is a demographic replacement. We've lost London. Okay? The capital of Britain is inhabited by a majority of people who are not British. The same, I guarantee, will be said of Birmingham when the new census comes out. Saville was another example that we saw recently. Almost entirely populated by non-British people. Frankfurt, Germany, minority population of Germans. We've lost Frankfurt. Italy, projected to be a country in which the minority of the population are the Italians within the next 40 years. So we're not even losing capital cities and big cities. We're at the point of losing countries. This is the exact result, the exact same result of an invasion, but it's happening with immigration. So if you don't want this to happen, you need to start exploring the how to solve it. And it's not just violence or deportation that can be on the table. Things can be done to incentivize people to leave. Things can be done to make it uncomfortable for non-Europeans to be in Europe. For example, they don't get access to state-provided benefits, to the healthcare, to the social services, things like that. You get sent back to your country of origin if you don't find gainful employment within a year, for example. There is a tax on how many children you're bringing in to the country and how many children you produce while you're here, so that we don't become overrun and outpopulated, outbreeded. But all of these things, the classical liberals will say, are a violation of rights. But whose rights? We form societies and a civilization and endowed ourselves with these rights. It's like the people on the left demanding that the rights of the United States Constitution be applied to people who aren't even in the United States yet. This was one of the ways that they attempted to undermine Donald Trump's Muslim ban, saying that all these incoming Muslims or potential Muslims who would want to come to the United States are having their constitutional rights violated, but they're not even American citizens. They're not even in the United States yet. So the classical liberals, the individualists, often engage in absurd arguments as absurd as the open borders, tolerance and diversity is our strength. Leftists. But again, as far as this question of violence goes, this is an idea that goes bump in the night. It's scary. I don't want to fight anyone. The idea of having to fight for my life or take the life of someone else is terrifying. At the same time, we need to stop acting like gardeners in a war and start acting like warriors in a garden. We are facing an existential threat. If you can't acknowledge this, then I'm sorry, I have nothing to say to you. But if you are someone, on whatever side, doesn't matter, if you are someone who acknowledges this, that it's not a good thing that London is lost, that Savilletown is lost, that Frankfurt is lost, that we're losing France, that there are all these no-go zones, that hundreds of people have died in terrorist attacks and in murders perpetrated by third world migrants under the guise of refugee status. If you're opposed to all of this and you recognize it as a problem, then you have to recognize the existential threat. If you recognize the facts of demography and that this is not a good thing, that demographic replacement is something that is real and negative, then you acknowledge that it's an existential threat by definition. And so, when one is faced with an existential threat, even the radical centrist himself, Sargon of Akkad, mentioned this, proclaimed this in a recent video, that in certain situations, especially situations of an existential threat, values move up and down the hierarchy of morality. So, for example, the non-aggression principle is something to live by in a time of peace, when you're not being threatened. But if someone starts trying to kill you or your wife or your children, the non-aggression principle falls down the hierarchy, and the value of self-defense, in any way, shape, or form, moves up, and you now have the right to defend yourself, violently so, aggressively so, against the attacker. So, when it comes to this question of violence and how to reclaim our lands and proclaim our lands for our people. And if that is a viable method, a justifiable method, well, I think that it's just probably inevitable. And I said it before, and I'll say it again, I think that's terrifying. These things that go bump in the night keep me awake at night. I do fear a violent death. I do fear that I will grow old in an increasingly violent and chaotic society. And that the older I get and the more feeble I get, the more of a target will be on my back. And the more I and my people become the minorities. And the more that people who are filled with hate towards Europeans become the majority, then the more likely it is that this violent end will be a reality. So I encourage any European, especially those of you who live in diversified areas, to learn self-defense. If you've got the time, enlist in a self-defense class. Go to the gym, bulk up, get strong. Carry some form of self-defense, a pocket knife, pepper spray. Go out in groups when you go out. Don't let your girlfriends go off by themselves. The situation has changed. The values of the individual and democracy, democracy for all its faults, is a good system, but it's obvious that it's being undermined. It's obvious that it has become corrupt. It's obvious that democracy is being used against us, to destroy us. How are you going to defend democracy when there are Sharia supporting Islamic parties in European parliaments? When they hold seats in the parliaments of Holland, France, Belgium? Where's your democracy going to get you then? It's going to get you killed. It's going to get you in second-class citizen status. The situation has changed. It's an existential threat. The value of democracy moves down a bit, and the value of self-preservation moves up a bit. And there is no vice in self-defense. And I would argue that any act, whether it's deportations or tearing down mosques or declaring that Islam is not a recognized religion, as Slovakia has done, is not extreme, it's not a vice, it's justifiable, it's self-defense, it's self-preservation. So yes, the freedom of religion was something that we upheld until it became something used against us and posed an existential threat. I mean, I watched a video of a Scottish nationalist challenging Majid Nawaz, who presents himself as this reformist or Muslim reformer, someone who stands up against extremist Islam and political correctness and things like that. But he isn't. And during this conversation, he even says to the Scottish nationalist, "What's your solution to Islam? We're here now. What are you going to do about us? What are you going to do about it?" Go on Twitter and engage with these minority groups, the people of color, the various people from the Middle East, Africa, who now live in Europe. And they're quite clear. They consider this a conquest. They consider this an invasion. They themselves consider this an invasion. And they're winning. And they know it. And they love it. They're here now. They outnumber us in our cities. and capitals. And soon they're going to spread to the villages and the countryside. And they want access to the things that our ancestors, our parents, and our grandparents built. They want access to us. And they think that it's a human right. So any action against this is simply self-defense. So truly, I will say it. Uphold religious freedom, great. When the discussion is how much influence should religions of the West, Christianity, have, Catholicism, important conversation, important separation, you might argue. I think Christianity is vital to the West, but that's a different topic. But now here comes Islam. And it's not the same as Buddhism. It's not the same as Christianity. It's not the same as Scientology or Mormonism. I don't have any problem with what Slovakia did. I would recommend it to every Western country. Declare Islam an unrecognized religion. Prohibit the construction of mosques. Yes, have a Muslim ban. Just come right out and say it. And to hell with these hand-wringing types about, freedom of religion, no religious test. All right. Well, if you don't change anything, if you don't do anything, in 30 years, in 40 years, in 50 years, your children and your grandchildren will be living in a caliphate. Is that what you want? All right, and you might say, well, I don't think that's just a guess. We don't know if that's going to happen. All right, roll the dice. Look at history. Can you point to any civilization, any country, any culture that was overtaken by Islam and did not become Islamic? Again, regarding the violence issue, look at history. Can you point to any time where a group of people came into a society, came into a country, attempted to take power from the native population, and there wasn't a conflict? Attempted to drive out the native population, and there wasn't a conflict? Think of any situation in history, any time in history, where the native population resisted the invader, resisted the occupant, and there wasn't a conflict? I'm reading a book right now called Icarus Fallen, and it describes the state of Western man in the 21st century, after the disastrous 20th century. What condition is he in right now? And one of the things that Western man has to do in the 21st century is relearn some basic truths that we thought we could free ourselves from, that we thought we could transcend. And one of them is we need to relearn that politics is conflict. Now, as I've said before, I would hope that this conflict can be soft and non-violent. Okay? We see it happening in Italy right now. Salvini is ordering bulldozers to tear down gypsy camps that are living, squatting illegally, occupying people's homes or areas of land illegally. And he just said, okay, done. No more beating around the bush. Bulldozers. Boom. Clearing the land. Clearing them out. And of course, it's met with massive protests and claims that it's violating human rights. We keep playing by the left's game and the globalist game. And these individualist types, the classical liberals, are not helping because they play along with it too. They are accepting the new notion of human rights, that basically everything can be a human right, including the right to live in the West, the right to migrate to the West. But I can oppose that. I can say, no, it's not a human right. And a lot of this can be undone with policy. It was created by policy. It was created by a pen stroke. It can be undone with a pen stroke. And that's what my hope is. But we have to be realistic here. It's not if there will be violence. The violence is already here. And so I have no problem stating that in the act of self-defense, violence is justified. And in the act of self-preservation, violence is justified. So, for example, the violence that I would justify would be if we were going to deport the thousands of jihadis, for example, that walk amongst us, the thousands of failed asylum seekers that walk amongst us, and they resist, I have no problem using force to expel them. And using force and the long arm of the law to also neutralize anyone who would support them. The activist types, for example. Imprison them as well. Give them criminal charges. Now, is this violence? I don't think so. It's not a violation of human rights. I don't think so. Another example would be, I mentioned earlier, just basic self-defense. Carrying pepper spray or a knife. The situation has changed. Going out in groups, not letting your wives or girlfriends be unattended when you go out on a weekend. Especially if you live in big cities or diversified areas. Okay? Just a few weeks ago, in the country I live, in Spain, a couple was attacked, trapped in an elevator, and attacked by 14 Moroccans. And they sexually assaulted the woman and stabbed the boyfriend who tried to defend her. And the worst part is, there was not a single condemnation from the state, from the prime minister, from the feminists. The only reaction that the state had, or the feminists had, was to condemn the only political party who spoke out and condemned this attack. A small nationalist party called Vox, whose support is increasing for obvious reasons. So the feminists were completely silent about this sexual assault. But they did speak up to criticize the leader of Vox as a xenophobe and a racist for condemning what these 14 Moroccans did and asking, what the fuck are they doing here? Why are we permitting this? The media was completely silent. This is in a country where every day, if you watch the news, they will have a story about how, some man in Madrid arrested after pushing his wife down the stairs. And they call it violencia machista, sexist violence, violence against women. They're obsessed with this in Spain. Spain is a feminist dictatorship in many ways. And so, some guy in Madrid pushes his girlfriend. Some guy in Madrid punches his wife. It makes national news. 14 Moroccans attack and stab a couple in an elevator, and they are silent. So this means that no one is looking out for us. No one is looking out for you. No one cares. So you better start defending yourself. You better realize that the time for being a gardener in a war is over. The violence is already here. What's going to happen to those 14 Moroccans? Probably nothing. In fact, one of them was seen on a news broadcast after the event, but I think he was actually on the television before the event, but then they dug it up and said, hey, look, this was one of the guys who allegedly committed this attack. And there he is in front of the camera saying, fuck the police. Fuck the Guardia Civil. They're a bunch of racists. They act with impunity. They are invaders. And in the case of an invasion, the native population has every right to fight back. I have no qualms saying that. Is it a pleasant situation? Is it a situation that I want to happen? No. I think it's terrifying. I think we are walking like zombies to a conflict that will be so destructive, so hellish, that it's unimaginable. And we're walking in that direction because people like the Civ Nats and the individualists can't stop wringing their hands and going on and on and on about values and not seeing the existential threat that is staring them in the face. And then I wonder, the other thing that goes bump in the night is, well, exactly who will the sides be? I think there will be violence in the streets, definitely. But that won't be the main conflict. That won't be what creates the hellscape. In the end, as it usually tends to do, the conflict will rise to state versus state level. And given the capacity for destruction inherent in modern weaponry, we're talking untold millions of victims, of deaths, untold levels of destruction. Democracy, the vote, referendums, we're seeing how ineffectual they are. I still believe that your vote matters and we should vote. 2019, May, the European parliamentary elections. Vote in them. I'll be making a video closer to that date about the various parties that I think are worth our votes. But I have to be realistic at the same time. It doesn't look like it makes much of a damn difference. Because we have these supranational organizations like the EU and the UN undermining the democratic vote. And we have demographic changes that are undoing democracy or a constitutional republic and just denigrating it into mob rule and breeding wars. So it doesn't matter if we have a Matteo Salvini or a Viktor Orban or a UKIP or a referendum on Brexit or a referendum even on immigration. I would love that. I would think that's a great idea. I came across this idea a few months ago. An Italian pundit, and also I think he's also a psychologist, suggested and wrote a piece about how we need to demand an immigration referendum. Europe-wide. But what does it matter when the UN will just come up with the Global Migration Compact, which basically legalizes mass immigration? So now you can't even stand on the grounds of we don't want illegal immigration, because the UN is going to tell you it's all legal now. You have to let these people in. We've expanded the definition of refugee. So now they're all refugees, and you are obliged to take them in. They're all asylum seekers. You're obliged to give them asylum. And you can't criticize it. Who voted for that? How did democracy prevent that? What's your solution to that? You know, it reminds me of that quote from 1984. If you want a vision of the future, imagine a boot stamping on a human face forever. Well, when we've got things like the EU and the UN, people talk about reforming the EU. How? Do you think these people are going to relinquish power? That they're just going to put their tail between their legs and slink away? Not without conflict. We are coming out of the post-history mentality. As Millennial Woe said, history is coming back. And as Chantal Del Sol writes in this book, Icarus Fallen, we need to relearn that politics is conflict, that conflict is part of the human experience, that land is valuable and you fight for it, that your people matter, and that you have the right to choose with whom you want to live. Sometimes I wonder if it's too late. Another thing that keeps me up at night. Is it too late? How do you stop the fall of Rome? How do you reverse irreversible degeneracy and decay? When the weeds have grown so tall and so thick, and even the gardener thinks now that the weeds are flowers and doesn't want to pull them out. What do you do? I wonder if the wheel of history just cannot be stopped and we have to let it take its course. And that really makes me sad. I grew up in America. I come from the United States. And I went to Europe. I moved back to Europe, to the lands of my ancestors, my father, because I wanted to live amongst the man-made beauty of Europe. I wanted to live in a country that has a culture and deep traditions and has a unified, homogeneous society, because I know what it's like in America. The American experiment isn't working anymore. But unlike a lab experiment, you can't just go back and do it over. So in America, like what we just saw with Black Friday, the culture now is empty. There are no traditions. There is no beauty. It's all consumerism. It's hollowed out people, soulless people, who have been reduced to consumers, to cogs in a machine. This is the boot stamping on the human face, on the human spirit, forever. Is this the future? I don't know. A large part of me thinks that this is it. This is the future until Armageddon, basically, until a mass correction, big conflict. The acceleration, they call it. So I don't know. But Black Friday is now in Europe. European shops doing Black Friday sales. Europeans running to the shops to get deals on electronic goods and made in Indonesia clothes. And all the while, our sense of who we are, our traditions, our culture is hollowed out and replaced with nothing. What do you do about that? Is a renaissance possible? Is a rebirth possible? One of the discussions that I listened to posed this hypothetical. Would you rather have white European Antifa or African Christians, free market people, free speech supporters, people who believe in the values of Western civilization? Would you rather have 10,000 white European Antifa come into your society, or 10,000 Africans or Muslims, but they believe in Western civilization? I would choose the 10,000 Antifa, because you can fight against them. You can oppose them. You can change their minds, maybe. I think so. Governments change, systems change, values change. The Polish people lived under Nazism and communism. They were wiped off the map. Their country was wiped off the map. But they still survived. They existed. And they are here now. They are still here. So yeah, I would take 10,000 bloody Antifa people, oppose them, try to survive and defeat them. Then take in 10,000 people who are not of my people, my blood and soil. Invite them in, shake their hands and get along fine because they uphold my values, whatever those are. But then slowly replace me and my people. And then it doesn't matter what the system is, what the economics are. We don't exist anymore. Who gives a shit? These are basic truths that we need to relearn fast. How do you stand up to the UN and the EU? How do you reclaim your lands? We have to try every avenue. Voting, activism, debating, yes. But while we argue, the boats keep coming. They're not coming to Italy anymore. The numbers have gone down, but they're coming to Spain now. And the same thing happens. The migrants escape. They slip through the system. Nobody knows what becomes of them. While we argue, the UN concocts the Global Migration Pact, which will undo any good work that Salvini or Orban or Brexit or whatever tries to do, any attempts to reclaim our lands and proclaim nationalist ideals. So I think it's inevitable that there will be conflict. That doesn't mean it's something I condone or encourage or look forward to. The opposite. But let's stop cucking about here. The time for empty words is over. It's been over for a long time. The hour has come to start doing something about this. And if you don't care about the people of Europe or European descent, you don't care, as Ben Shapiro says, about the browning of America, you only care about the values, fine. You're someone I'll argue with. You're as much dead weight to me as an SJW. But if you are someone who realizes that this is a problem, this is an existential threat, you need to realize that in times of great distress, extraordinary actions need to be taken. Extraordinary, out of the ordinary. Ordinarily, I believe in the rights of the individual. I believe in the values of democracy and constitutional republics and things like this. The non-aggression principle. But we are not in ordinary situations. So put everything on the table. Deportations, making life uncomfortable and unappealing to people who are non-Europeans, to Muslims, to these sub-Saharan African men who keep jumping border fences and pretending to be refugees and boarding boats and stepping on European shores, running onto the beaches of Spain, and then just running into the continent. This has to end. It's time to turn on the light and face the things that go bump in the night. See you next time.